And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Anthony Peake, best-selling author and leading thinker in the area of consciousness studies, who's also studied NDEs for over 2 decades, which we're going to talk about and more. Anthony, thanks for joining me and welcome.
Jeff, I'm really looking forward to our chat and exchange of ideas.
Anthony, what was it about NDEs that piqued your interest so much anyways?
I suppose, like most, I would say, intelligent people, that makes me presume I'm intelligent. But most people, the great mystery is life and what happens when we die. And even as a child, I suddenly realized something incredibly curious, that the universe had existed for billions of years without me. And when I die and cease, it will go on for billions of years. And as I said in one of my books, it means that all that happens is that for a very short period of time, something was aware of something and disappeared. And to me, that sounded like such a waste. And it made no particular sense to me. But I could understand from my interest in science and my interest in many factors that that seems to be the evidence of what it could be. But I wanted to know more. I wanted to ask deeper questions about what is really going on in this world, because most societies from the earliest times have an idea that there is an afterlife. And the question is, each society has a different answer as to what the afterlife is. And it could be us just clinging on to hope, because the problem is that if we don't have this hope, it means that life is just ultimately sad, because either you die or everybody you love dies and all your friends die. And that has to be more than that. And I'm also fascinated, as a final point as well, the great mystery of everything is time. You know, the idea that the past has already gone, so it doesn't exist. The future is yet to be, so therefore doesn't exist. So the only thing that exists is the present moment. And every time you think and try to capture the present moment, it's gone. It's gone into the past. It comes from the future, appears from the future. We perceive it, and then it disappears into the past. So these are the great questions of my life. And ever since going to university in the early 1970s, where I specialized in the sociology of religion and the sociology of language, and one or two other subjects as well. I'm also a historian by training. But it's something that has always interested me. And when I had the opportunity to write a book 25 years ago, and had a publisher who was interested in buying the rights for the book from me, because in other words, I'm not self-published. You know, I am traditionally published. My publisher pays me in advance and pays me to write the books. So I'm quite fortunate in that, because it does mean that my books are distributed around the world, which is really, really good. So that's what I wanted to write about. And now, 13 books later, I still sit back with astonishment to realize I had 13 books in me. You know, where the hell did all that come from? But that's basically the background.
What happens to us immediately after we die?
Now that is absolutely fascinating, because it's always interested me, because the near-death experiences have been recorded throughout history. And in my new book, I do a total analysis of both the anthropology, the history, and the science of near-death experiences. And throughout history, near-death experiences have been described. You know, it's not just it's a modern phenomenon. A lot of people will argue that because Raymond Moody wrote his book in the early 1970s, and therefore nobody had really thought or discussed about near-death experiences before then. But the actual reality of the fact is they just weren't called near-death experiences, but people still had experiences whereby when they were close to death, they went somewhere else, or they encountered other entities, and they went somewhere else, they were then told they needed to go back again. Now, what again is intriguing here is that near-death experiences have been reported not only across historical times, but they've also been reported in virtually every single culture across the world. And although there are subtle cultural differences, the phenomenon is still very similar. You know, people have a sensation of rising outside of the body. They have a sensation that time changes. They have a sensation where they get a panoramic life review, where they see their life flash before their eyes. They have an impression of noeticness, the feeling of something different. And when they come back, most of them are changed beyond all understanding. And it's not at all surprising because if it is a genuine phenomenon, then you will change your worldview. It will change you totally. And a good friend of mine, Dr. Penny Satori, who in the UK, and I think even in America, is quite a famous researcher on the subject. I mean, she wrote a book a few years ago called about the changes that people have when they have near-death experiences. So there is something here of importance. But for me, I want to know more. I want to understand, when people describe these things, is it simply neurological? And even if it is neurological, what does it mean? Now, when we approach death, ordinarily, in one of my books, I say that there's only really three alternatives when we die. The first one is the standard materialist reductionist argument, which we touched on before, which is when you die, that's it, you're just gone. Everything you've achieved, everything you've done is literally a waste of time, because you're gone, as is everybody you love will just disappear and will just be a memory to other people. Now, that's what modern science tells us. Now, for me, that doesn't necessarily make sense, but it could be scientifically correct. But then you have the second alternative, which is the alternative put forward by many, many religions. And it's the idea that you die and you go to somewhere else. You go into another location, which is non-physical, which, for want of a better term, people call heaven. And you go there and you meet your loved ones and you live for all eternity in this location, this beautiful world, that people describe sometimes when they have near-death experiences. Now, the problem for me with that is that all eternity is an awful long time. However much you may find the environment of heaven wonderful, you're there forever. You will never die. You move on. You've already died. So you're in this eternal place. And you're going to get bored, with the best will in the world. You're not going to be eating food in the same way. You're not going to be having to be coarse about this, falling in love, having sex, all the things that keeps life interesting, you're not going to have. And, an awful lot of fundamentalist religions will say you're just there to glorify God. What for all eternity, singing to God his praises, again, makes no particular sense to me. So then you have the third alternative. And the third alternative is reincarnation. And the idea that you die, and then either immediately or after a given period of time, your soul is reimplanted into another, and you're reborn again, somewhere else in the world, somewhere else, maybe in historical times or wherever, but you're literally reborn. And you live your life again, or you live a life again as somebody else. Now, again, for many, many years, I found this quite an attractive idea. But I had issues because, A, I didn't know how the mechanism worked, because effectively the brain, whatever else we say, there is a direct relationship between brain functioning and consciousness and awareness. There is a relationship. We know this. So the question is, if the brain is dead, how can we be anything? Okay. And in which case, what is it that transfers into another body? And what mechanism is it by which the transference takes place, the transmigration? And the other argument is that if you are reborn again, if you're reborn as somebody else, how can you ever evolve? And by this, I mean, when people are ordinarily reincarnated, they don't remember who they are. That's the whole point of it, isn't it? You're reborn and you have no past life memories, except arguably if you do hypnotic regression, and you take somebody and you regress them back, you might be able to regress them back into a prior past life. And I'll touch on this later, because I know that a lot of people will say, hypnotic regression is a really interesting phenomenon, and it is. But I question some of the elements of it. So the question is that I have had a whole life and I die at 75, and then I'm reborn again as somebody else. And then I start again. I've forgotten all the experiences I've had and everything else. And there's a concept we know, to learn by one's mistakes. The only way you can actually evolve is by learning from your mistakes and realizing the things you did last time were the wrong things to do, morally or whatever. But you need to know that you made those mistakes. So to me, the only way that reincarnation can work as a concept is if there's still a part of you that remembers your previous lives. And that part of you carries through with you through various lives. Now, again, within Eastern traditions, there is the concept of the soul, which is the essence of you that carries from life to life to life. And that bit remembers you, remembers what you did in your past lives. But then I became curious because there is a phenomenon known as deja vu. The recognition, the idea that you are recognizing you've lived this life before in some place or other. And people argue that that's evidence of reincarnation. But I started to reflect on this and I thought, well, no, deja vu can't be that. Because if I have a deja vu sensation now, or for argument's sake, I'm in a theatre and I suddenly have this recognition that I've seen this place before. Well, funnily enough, I had a deja vu sensation when you were talking before. When we were talking before we started, we were talking about Scientology and we were talking about Saint Hill Manor and various other things. And when you were talking about that, I thought to myself, I've done this before. I've had this conversation with Jeff before. We've had this conversation before. Now, that intrigued me. Now, if it was a past life remembrance, you wouldn't be in a studio with a mic in front of you wearing a collar and tie. You'd be wearing medieval clothes, or you'd be wearing something from Victorian times. But you're not. You're wearing Western garb using technology of the 21st century to interface with me, which means that whatever that deja vu memory was, it wasn't of the past life. And I argue that it's because it's not. A deja vu is a memory of a past life, but a past life is you. So in other words, the recognition takes place because we have had this conversation before. In fact, we've had this conversation many, many times. And deja vu is the remembering of that.
Let me stop you for one moment because I want to make sure I'm comprehending all this. You said the past life is you.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Okay. I argue that I have a concept called cheating the ferryman. And it's a theme that's been all through my books. And it's the idea that we are living in a simulation, or more accurately, an instantation of our lives. I'll give you the example. When you play a third-person computer game, you sit down in front of your computer, you switch the game on, and if it's a kind of an adventure story, you have an on-screen sprite, an on-screen avatar, which you can manipulate through your keyboard or through your mouse, and you can move that person in a three-dimensional on-screen reality that's seems three-dimensional. Like, for my generation, it was very much Lara Croft and Tomb Raider. And you move Lara along a corridor, and she goes into a room, and a big monster comes out and kills her. Lara is dead. So that one entity that was Lara that you created is now dead. But you start the game again, and you recreate a new Lara as the game player. So suddenly you've lived one life, and you're about to live another one. And this time you have information as the game player that you know that there's a monster in that room. So using that knowledge, you will ensure that Lara doesn't go into that room. And she goes into another room and she gets eaten again, or she gets killed again. So you can see where I'm going with this. Over a period of games, you live the perfect game. You complete the game. And I genuinely believe this is what life is. It's like Groundhog Day. You live your life over and over again. And this is one argument I was saying before about learning by your mistakes. Because effectively, the game player is an entity I call the daemon. And it's from ancient Greek. And it is the concept of a spirit that guides you, a spirit guide. And your daemon is that voice in your head that you hear, or that sensation you have and that feeling you get when you first meet somebody for the first time. And there's something you know about that person that is just subliminal. You just know that you're either going to be really good friends or they're going to be a problem to you or whatever. And we all have these experiences. And this is because your daemon is watching through your eyes and realizes what happened last time with this person. And it knows. And it will try and communicate with you to warn you or to guide you, like a person in a computer game does, like the game player does in a computer game, warning the person on screen. Now, imagine a scenario that you can have a computer game that's so sophisticated that you can engage in a virtual reality version of that game, in a haptic feedback suit, for want of a better term, that when you move your hands as the game player, the person on screen moves, and you're actually embedded in the game. And then imagine that within that game, you suffer what the ancient Greeks called amnesis, that you have forgotten that you've lived your life before. And you live within the game, and you live a whole life within the game, and then you die. Now, the person on screen, the person who's in the game, I called an eidolon. And again, it's from ancient Greek. So you have an eidolon, which lives one life and forgets everything and dies. Then you have the daemon, which is the game player, that lives multiple lives as you and guides you through your life. Now, this is not so strange in that a lot of philosophers have argued this for many, many years. The idea, it's called the eternal recurrence or the eternal return. And it's the central point of a lot of religions. And I've discovered over the years that not only this, but my concept is also the central concept in the teachings of an awful lot of esoteric traditions that keep their ideas secret. And I've been told on numerous occasions, I need to be very careful about these ideas because there'll be people noticing that you're actually blowing the lid off it all, that this is actually what is really taking place. And the concept then of the daemon suddenly makes sense. People have spirit guides. People have this sensation that there's somebody else with them. The very fact that the human brain is bicameral, that the human brain has two hemispheres, is interesting, because this is not just my idea. This is all based upon absolute solid neurology. For example, we have two hemispheres for the brain. And if you cut the corpus callosum of the brain, that is the thing that holds the two sides of the brain together, you end up with two personalities, two completely different personalities. This was a series of operations done in the 1950s and 1960s by a couple of researchers, and the main guys, Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry. In fact, Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for this work he was doing. And this is intriguing. We know that there is another person in our heads, and it's been proven by deep hypnotism. If you actually go deep down into hypnotism, different levels of consciousness, where you go deeper and deeper, you go deeper enough, you will find somebody else. And this somebody else is much more knowledgeable than you are. In fact, sometimes this somebody else can be dismissive. A lot of researchers who've been into hypnotism have said this as well. So what we do is like a computer game, we live the game over and over again. Now, this is then explains the near-death experience. Because remember, in the near-death experience, I mentioned that one of the major issues is something called the Moody traits. Raymond Moody came up with them. And there are 6 or 7 traits that most near-death experiencers describe. And I mentioned one of them, the panoramic life review. And the panoramic life review is, I saw my life flash before my eyes. Now, that intrigued me because I thought, well, how can that be? How can, when you're dying, your life flash before your eyes? Because it suggests your life has been recorded, doesn't it? Because how else can your life be seen in a series of images, or instances in your life can be relived in 3 dimensions, as some people argue they have done? How can that be? It suggests a recording. So I did a lot of research on this, and I discovered, to my astonishment, that it is generally believed that the human brain records everything. It records every experience we have. It's just that it is not available to us, the eidolon, but it is available to the daemon. So it means that your whole life has already been recorded, and those memories carry forward with you in the final seconds of your life. Now, what I found it particularly interesting was in near-death experiences that people also encounter something called the being of light. And the being of light is an entity that's waiting for them when they die. You know, the being of light is there. There's this entity that's there that people will recognize as being a religious figure or a friend or somebody that makes them feel safe and happy. But my research in my latest book, and I've known this for many years, there's a problem with the being of light, because whatever it is, it's not what it's pretending to be. Because sometimes the being of light can be, with children particularly, can be school friends who are still alive, can be school teachers. They can be cartoon characters. Mickey Mouse. The kids see Mickey Mouse when they die, some of them. People see Elvis Presley. You know, so clearly it's whatever, it's disguising itself. So it knows this person's dying, what makes them feel at ease. So it'll manifest as Jesus, or it'll manifest as your grandmother, or whatever. And it guides you, and it says, right, I'm going to take you through your life and tell you the things that you did wrong or didn't do. That, I think, is crucial, because that being is your daemon. That being is your own higher self, who already has access to the memories. Now, again, I do the research of this in detail, and I'm particularly fascinated by individuals who have what's called superior autobiographical memory, HSAM. And these are individuals who literally remember everything in their lives. And there's a handful of them around the world. And they literally don't forget anything, including their dreams, including being in the womb. And I interviewed one of them, a young Australian lady, 2 or 3 years ago. And I tested her live on radio, whereby I knew that she liked Harry Potter, the Harry Potter books. And my assistant on the podcast, I said to my assistant, who had a young daughter, and I said, your daughter has all the Harry Potter books, don't you? And she said, yes. And I said, can you pick one of the books out on random? Which she did. And I said, can you open a page at random, at that random book, and then read a random paragraph? And then I asked my guest, and I said, how many words can you get in, and can you finish the paragraph? She got no more than 6 words in. And the young woman said the whole paragraph, word for word perfect. Okay. Now that was done live. And if you go onto my YouTube channel, I've actually taken that section out as evidence and proof. Now we know that there are people who have savant syndrome who have this same skill. They remember everything. So the question is, where are these records? Where are these memories? And these memories are there specifically because you're drawing up information from the game. And again, I do the science, and I believe that all the information of the field is in something called the 0-point field, which is to do with quantum mechanics, which we haven't got time to do now. But I argue at the point of death, you draw up this information. And now remember, I said that in the panoramic life review, people say their life flashed before their eyes. I think that's a very important point, because in a near-death experience, that's what happens. But I'd argue that in a real death experience, where the person doesn't come back to tell us, the person actually dies, I think they have a totally different experience. That flashing in front of their eyes doesn't flash. It is a literal minute-by-minute recreation of their life, which they go into. They literally are reborn as themselves. And as they go through that second life with the subtle guidance of their daemon, there will be occasions where the Eidolon will think, I've been here before. That's a déjà vu. It's actually technically a déjà vécu, already lived. Now, there are various neurological explanations for déjà vu. I think at last count, there are 72. And my hypothesis is one of them within those 72 that academics talk about, the cheating the ferryman idea. So they can't all be right. And the standard neurological explanation is something called the visual pathways hypothesis, put forward by a guy called Robert Efron in 1962, where he argued literally it's the visual signal from one eye going into your non-dominant hemisphere is perceived a split second before the actual information is processed by your dominant hemisphere. So you kind of get this echo of recognition. The only thing is that a few years ago, that was completely disproved neurologically by a guy called Akira O'Connor at the University of Leeds here in the UK, where people who were born blind had déjà sensations where they heard things, they heard something and they heard it again. And the neurological basis of the brain doesn't work for hearing as it does for sight. So clearly there is something going on here that is of great importance. Because I then argue that what we do is we live our life many, many times, not just once. You know, in the movie Groundhog Day, the central character Connors lives Groundhog Day many times. Now, again, I interviewed Danny Rubin, who was the guy that wrote the original script for Groundhog Day. And Danny is a lecturer, or was a lecturer at Harvard. And when Danny came across my first book, Is There Life After Death, he gave copies of that book to all his friends because he said, this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day. Because Danny told me he had a plan that Connors would live that life thousands of times. And each time it would be subtly different because he'd do different things. Because you remember Connors, he remembers what he did the day before. So he amends what he does the next day. And I argue that's because the Connors character in Groundhog Day is effectively a daemon and an eidolon together. The eidolon, the person that lives life once, is molded to the daemon that has all the memories. I call that a dyad. Because remember what he does in the movie. Every day he changes things. He starts to do selfish things. Then he realizes that he has all the time in the world to learn how to do things. So he teaches himself how to play the piano. He reads all the novels he ever wants to read, all effectively to impress the girl that he wants to bed. But he then starts doing good for doing good's sake, doesn't he? He's running around the town. He tries to save the little boy falling out of the tree, helps the little old lady across the road. And I think that is a wonderful moral story, but it's a very important story because what it means is that he starts doing good for doing good's sake. He becomes a better human being. He becomes what the Buddhists would call a bodhisattva. He's a person who, and a Buddha, he is a person who's lived the perfect life. So again, you can see the analogy of the computer game where you go backwards and forwards. Now imagine a scenario, the movie would not work if Connors didn't remember what he did the day before. Because if he didn't remember what he did the day before, there'd be no plot. He'd do exactly the same thing every day. But my cheating the ferryman hypothesis, the idea, by the way, the cheating the ferryman is literally, I believe we cheat the ferryman. We never pay him. You know, the old Greek myth of ferryman comes through the mist, Charon, and you pay him an oboli and he takes you across to the land of the dead. I believe we cheat the ferryman. We never go across the River Styx. We think we do, but we don't. And I argue that, so in the final split seconds of your life, you live your whole life. Now, remember one of the other moody traits I mentioned was the idea of time seems to expand. People say it's one of the things that happens in the near-death experience is time is different. And I say this is again evidence of cheating the ferryman, because that's exactly what you expect to happen. Because time is such a curious phenomenon. I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time a few years ago about time and time perception. And it's most peculiar in that it's the only thing that is measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples, but you can only ever have a minute of a minute or an hour of an hour. And I've no idea whether your hour is the same as my hour. You know, I'm sure there are people who'll be watching this broadcast going, oh my God, this guy's going on and on. I feel like I've been listening to him for hours because he's so boring. But there might be other people that will say, my God, it's gone so quickly because it's so interesting. That's because we have our own inner clock, which means that when you start to die during the near-death experience, I argue that certain neurotransmitters are released in the brain, which are related to dimethyltryptamine and various other hallucinogenic substances. And it brings about an expansion of time. So it means that when you're dying in the final seconds, that could be a whole lifetime. It could be 10,000 lifetimes. But from the point of view of somebody else, they see you die. But for you, you never get to the point of death. It's called Zeno's bisection paradox, if anybody's interested, or more technically, something called Thomson's lamp, which I discuss. And the idea is you can bisect time into smaller bits of time, and you will never get to the point where you actually physically die because you're in smaller bits of time. So you have all the time in the world. And again, I know this takes place because of the effect that I am told by people who experience something called temporal lobe epilepsy. I was particularly intrigued when I was doing my initial research that the neurotransmitters that are released in the brain during a temporal lobe seizure are the same neurotransmitters that are released in the brain at the point of death. So whatever somebody, when they experience a temporal lobe seizure, is what we're all going to experience as we die. And the reason I know this is that there's so many cases I've come across of famous near-death experience cases where people are suffering something called status epilepticus, where they're having seizure after seizure. Now, for instance, one of the most famous cases is Ibn Alexander III, the famous Ibn Alexander case where, he had bacterial meningitis, and he has this whole phenomenal experience where he meets a long dead sister that he didn't know existed. He spends time flying on the wings of a huge butterfly, and he's in this amazing environment. Initially, it's not amazing, by the way. He's stuck in stinking mud at the start of it. That is exactly the description of what people experience when they take dimethyltryptamine, the hallucinogenic substance DMT. The links between DMT and the near-death experience are powerful. And again, in my new book, I cite a great number of research papers that have been done on linking DMT with the near-death experience. It's so similar. And this is where it gets very intriguing, because I believe that you can also link the near-death experience to alien abductions. So I'm linking the two themes that you have in your podcast, your excellent podcast, the near-death experience and UFOs and alien abductions. And these are exactly the things I've been talking about over the last few years at Contact in the Desert. And every year I go back, there's more and more people wanting to come and see me talk, because it resonates with so many people, because what I'm saying is so radically different to what everybody else is saying. And I'm linking the things. Now, for instance, I have cases in my book of individuals who've had near-death experiences that are effectively alien abductions. I'll give an example, and it's really classic one. There was in the early 1980s, there was a lady called Dorothy Ellen Counts, who was an anthropologist working in New Guinea. Well, actually, a place called New Britain, which is an island off New Guinea. And she was an anthropologist working with the local tribes people. And she came across a number of stories that were very similar to Western near-death experiences. But the difference is that the near-death experiences that are experienced by people in those cultures are very much based upon their own belief systems. And you may or may not be aware, but in the Second World War, when the Americans were fighting the Japanese in New Guinea, the American Air Force used to drop in goods and things and build air bases. And the local people came to the conclusion that this is how you got things from God. If you built an air base and plastic planes, God would bring the goods for you. They're called cargo cults. And again, I studied cargo cults at university. Now, it means that when people have near-death experiences in New Guinea, they have near-death experiences involving going to factories that are making goods and everything. It's really extraordinary. It's very, very different. But they also have the same concepts of going outside of, floating outside of the body, the out-of-body experience, the time dilation, and the meeting of other people and meeting dead people while they're there. But what is particularly interesting is there was one particular case where this guy, he sees a beam of light, a guy called Andrew, and he sees this beam of light and he feels himself being sucked up this beam of light to this house. And inside the house, there are beings he describes as children. They're like little children. They're greys. And he describes how they take him into this house. And when he's in the house, he realizes something strange. He realizes that the house is actually revolving. And not only that, but it's hovering above the ground and it's turning round. It's a UFO. It's like the Travis Walton case. He's sucked into it like a tractor beam. And if you read his experiences, taking into account UFO law and abduction law, it's spot on. It's an NDE based upon alien abduction. Now he describes what happens to him. And he's not alone in this. There are individuals in other cultures that describe when they died, they went to a place where people cut them open, where they dismember them. It's the classic alien abduction trope, isn't it? Where they cut me open and they did all these things to me. Now, again, this goes back deep into history. Because if you realize that this is similar to alien abductions, it suddenly starts to make sense. Because throughout history, there's something called shamanic traveling, where the shamans will go into altered states of consciousness. And when they do, they find themselves rising up outside of their body, like a near-death experience, and they go somewhere else. And in the somewhere else, they are cut to pieces. They are worked upon. They are eviscerated. This is the same idea. So I argue that near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, dimethyltryptamine experiences, and near-death experiences are all facets of the same phenomenon. It's just we interpret it depending upon our cultural values and our expectations. Because I argue that the phenomenon itself is reacting to us. It fulfills our expectations of what we expect it to be. Like you'll know as a UFO person, in the 1890s, you had the UFOs with the airships. And in the airships, there were Germans or they were Europeans and they were human. Then as time goes on and we get into the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, the aliens and the machines change. They're no longer airships. They're Foo Fighters. Or the aeroplanes, like in the 1940s in Norway, where people were seeing these aircraft coming up, which they thought were the Soviets. And then you get into the 1950s and you get the Space Brothers. You know, you get the tall Nordic characters who are here to help us. And it's because that's what Hollywood was creating. You know, and suddenly then, you know, in 1947, 48, with Keith Arnold, when he at Mount Rainier, when he saw the UFOs or he saw the flying saucers for the first time, suddenly we're then technologically different. But they're almost as if they follow our technology, as if they're always just a little bit ahead. And then in the 1960s, you then got the Hopsville goblins, and you got the kind of nasty looking entities that were different shapes, different sizes. But they were still in UFOs. And then, of course, you get into the 70s, and after Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, suddenly you have greys. And suddenly the greys are everywhere. Now, my mother herself saw a grey when she was when she was in a state of sleep paralysis, which was a precursor for her Alzheimer's. And she saw her grey in her room. She wouldn't know what a grey was, but she described this creature, which was a grey. So clearly there are linkages here. And I argue, I have something I call the egregorial hypothesis. And it's the idea that we are co-creating these things. And I argue this because we create everything. Human consciousness collectively creates the external hallucination, what we think is the external world. You and I are co-creating this environment now because our brains are melding, our brains are creating this. And I say this because of two or three things to do with quantum mechanics. Everything that's physical around us, we never touch. People think we touch things. You think you touch a table, or you touch your wife, or you touch your friends or your children. You don't. At the edge of every atom in your body and the edge of every atom of the object you're touching, the outer shell of each atom has electrons in it. And electrons are negatively charged particles. And the atoms of your fingers, as you touch something, also has electrons at the end of the shells of their atoms. Now, you remember from school, a negative charge and a negative charge, like a magnet, you pull them together, you can't get them to touch because they're repulsing each other. And this is what literally happens. When you feel you're feeling something, you're actually feeling what's called the electrostatic repulsion. So we never touch anything. So that's the first major point that people need to grasp when they think that reality is what it seems. You never interface with anything. You never touch it. But then again, the physical things we are physical are 99.9999999999996 empty space, as an example, which is the hydrogen atom, which I use as an example. And what is physical in there is literally the elements of the nucleus in the middle, which is incredibly tiny. And that's made up of a neutron and a proton. And the electrons are whizzing around. Neutrons and protons, or definitely neutron and proton, are made up of smaller things called quarks, which nobody's ever seen, and they're so infinitely tiny. They're point particles, which means they have no extension in space. So a collection of things that have no extension in space come together, trillions of them, to create the nucleus of the atom, which is mostly empty space anyway. And then you have the electron whizzing round, which is also a point particle, which has no extension in space. So suddenly, and these are everything that makes the physical world around us. There's nothing there at all. So then you think, well, yes, but I see things. I see things around me. Well, you don't actually. What you actually see is what your brain is creating from information it gains in the visual cortex, which is processing information from photons, which are tiny point particles of electromagnetic energy, which are hitting the retina at the back of your eye. Now, photons are very interesting things. Photons, again, have no extension in space. So all the light you see around you and all the things you see around it are photons bouncing off objects around you, countless numbers of them. But these photons themselves, each individual photon is just a point particle. It has zero mass. Now get this, it has zero mass, so it has no mass. So it doesn't exist as anything. But not only that, it can only ever travel at the speed of light. Now we know from Einstein that at the speed of light, there is no time. So from the point of view of the particles that are making you see the reality around you, there is no time. So those lights could have come from, those photons could have come from the sun. They could have come from a quasar 3.7 billion years ago, 13.7 or whatever. But it doesn't matter for them. It's the same instant. So suddenly the whole visual, the world we think is real, suddenly starts to get really weird.
You're saying that our brain is manufacturing what we think we're seeing, right? We're getting these photons are hitting our retina, and then we're making a neurochemical information that goes to our brain. But why do people during their NDE, when they're floating outside of their body, see what we're still seeing here using our brains when they're not using their brains?
And that's the major issue that scientists have with the near-death experience and the out-of-body experience. And it's a point I made in my very first academic paper that I wrote way back in 2003, 2004. And it's the argument that if my senses are correct, it means that I need external stimulants and a physiological mechanism to be able to see things. I need a brain and a visual cortex to process the information. I need an eye that has a lens that focuses the photons or the waves. And we don't want to go into the wave particle duality stuff because that gets even more complex. But the waves, the light waves, focuses the light waves onto the retina. But if I haven't got a retina because I'm outside of my body, how can I see anything? I can't because I don't have an eye. Indeed, I don't have ears. So the vibrations in the air that actually my drum vibrates, there's no drum to vibrate. So how can I see anything or hear anything when I'm in this state? And then the question is, well, if that is the case, what is really going on here? Well, I would argue that it's because we are misinterpreting what's taking place here. We are assuming that perception is a creation of the brain, because we're not even at first base and understanding, going back further as to what is in my head that is me, that's a self-referential point of consciousness. How is that created by my brain to be the observer of all this information, if I'm making sense? You know, so there is inside your head this observer, this homunculus that supposedly processes the information coming into the visual cortex here, and the hearing and the sights and the sounds. And they all come in as electrical impulses. And then they create this three-dimensional reality, which is then presented to this something in your head. But we have no idea. Modern science has no understanding or idea of how that something in your head comes about. It's called a hard problem of science. David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher in the mid-1990s, stood up at the University of Arizona and made exactly this point. We have no idea how electrical fields reacting with atoms and molecules can create Jeff or Tony. We have no idea. So if we then start thinking like that, we then start to realize that consciousness is a field. The brain effectively is a receiver of information that's already out there. So when you are out there in the information field, you can pick up the information in other ways. Now, for instance, I know of a number of individuals that I've worked with who've had veridical out-of-body experiences. Absolutely 100%. There's no doubt these people saw something in out-of-body state they could not have possibly known. And we know that people do this in near-death experiences as well. So we know it happens. So the argument is not, how does it happen? It can't happen because our science can't explain it. What we should turn around and say is, here is something that actually happens. Our science can't explain it. So we have to amend our science to accommodate the evidence. I mean, one of my associates, I'll very quickly tell you this. He had a guy called Graham Nichols, an out-of-body experiencer. He was doing a lecture one day and he felt his legs buckle back in 1999, December 1999, felt his leg buckle and he found himself coming to, and he was in an out-of-body state and he was in a jungle and he could feel a heat around him. And then he walks through the jungle, he pushes the plants apart and he's standing on the corner of Old Compton Street and Wardour Street in Soho in London. And he's standing there, a place he knows really well, and he's going, what's going on? And as he's doing so, you can hear in the distance people going, Graham, are you okay? And they were the people in the lecture theatre trying to bring him to. So he's then looking round, and then a kid runs past him, and he feels the air displacement as the child runs past. And he looks down the street, and he sees an explosion take place in the middle of the street. It's a pub, and it explodes. There's fire, and people are coming out covered in blood, and there's screams and everything else as well. And he's watching this thinking, this is extraordinary. Then he feels himself rise up into the air and he's coming to in the lecture theatre. So the first thing he turns round to the people in the lecture theatre and he says, there's going to be a terrorist bomb attack in Soho soon. Literally 1 week later, a bomb went off at the Admiral Duncan pub in exactly the street he described. A nail bomb. Now, I have no explanation for that. There is only 2 explanations that are possible. Well, maybe 3. Coincidence. Graham happened to just have a dream about a specific location. This wasn't a dream of seeing a plane crash. It was a specific dream about a specific location and a specific event. So statistically, I know from the statistics I've discovered, and probability, the chances of that are just ridiculously high. So it couldn't have been that. Couldn't have been coincidence. The second thing is that he's telling lies, as are all the people who were in the lecture theatre, because he's got signed affidavits for 5 or 6 people who witnessed it. So they're all lying together for some bizarre reason, because there's no financial benefit, but they're all just lying. So you could fall on that one. Or the third one is he had a precognitive out-of-body experience, which he saw the future. Now, there are no other options for that. I trust Graham implicitly. These people have signed affidavits, and I always challenge people who turn around and say, oh, this is nonsense. Well, you explain that one. And the only explanations they can come to is that. Now, to me, that means Graham was outside of his body, but he wasn't using his eyes. Or was he? Was he still embodied, but his brain was creating real information in an internally generated world, that his brain was still creating everything. He was still using his eyes and his ears, but his inner eyes and ears. Because I argue, if you just say you see through your eyes, what do you see when you're dreaming? What do you see when you have an hallucinogenic substance? What creates the hallucinations that people see? Because you see in a dream, you see in a DMT trip, you're still seeing, you're still hearing, you're still feeling. So the brain is still effectively creating that.
Could you say that as a conscious being outside of your body, you're still sending the signal to the brain?
Yes. In the same way that the brain attunes to many things around us. This is how telepathy works. You know, this is how remote viewing works. This is how we can perceive things. I have very powerful hypnagogic imagery. And I know I'm looking at something that really exists, you know, and just you're up to go to sleep and you'll see faces or you'll suddenly see this imagery. And I've had it since childhood. And I know I'm seeing something real because it looks real. You know, I've had one occasion where I was looking as a bird, I think it was, in a tree, looking over a square somewhere in Latin America. It was real. I know that place exists. I just know. I know I've lucid dreamed once where I had a lucid dream. I was physically there. I was flying in a lucid dream. You cannot tell me that it wasn't real because it was, you know, because I know from experience. Because as we say, you've got to empirically prove something correct. And I argue to people, the word empirical means from experience, literally. So if you've experienced these things and you have veridical backing data, it tells us something extraordinary. So for me, and I know we're running out of time now, but for me, and we didn't even touch upon the things we wanted to, but it was great that we didn't, that this is evidence that our modern science is very effective at explaining our experiences within this simulation. Our brains are trained to exist within this simulation. And I know this because of recent research that's been done with psilocybin, where volunteers have been taking psilocybin while their brains are being scanned. It's at the University of Sussex, just down the road from here. And what they expected was that the psilocybin would make the brain communicate more effectively to cause the hallucinations. Much to their astonishment, they discovered the opposite. It stops the brain functioning. It stops the brain communicating. And I'd argue this is because the brain is an attenuator. The brain is there to take information out. It's to stop us perceiving the greater reality that surrounds us, because we are trapped within this simulation, this instantation. And our everyday brain can only process the information it's supposed to. I'm not alone here. You look at the writings of Henri Bergson in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was the guy that first came up with the idea that the brain is to take information out. And then you look at the work of Aldous Huxley, 1954, The Doors of Perception. You look at philosophers such as C.D. Broad and numerous neurologists, and particularly people who study perceptual studies. And I'll make one final point here. Perceptual study experts and neurologists who study the workings of the brain and perception have a word they use to describe people who believe that what is out there, that is given to them by their senses, is what's really out there. They're known as naive realists. And I think that says it all.
In your example of us playing this game over and over again, we come back and we play the game like playing the game with Laura Croft. Do we play the game forever? Or
No.
do we finally finish the game and go play a new game and relive that over and over thousands of times?
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. I think one thing I have to first explain very, very quickly is I argue that the eidolon is the consciousness that lives life once. Then there's the daemon, who is your game player that lives your life many, many times. But I argue, and I can't prove this scientifically, and I never will be able to, I don't think, but I argue that above that, there's something I call the uber daemon, which is the consciousness of all humanity, which is a singular consciousness, and we are emanations. Your daemon is an emanation of a singular consciousness, which is all humanity. And this explains past life reviews, by the way. It explains how people, when they're hypnotized, go back to being a provincial peasant in France. It's because you're tuning into what Jung called the collective unconscious. And I have above that, I call it the godemon, which is the singular consciousness of everything. It's basically the consciousness field of the universe. And it's less and less refined as you get down to the eidolon, the daemon, the uber daemon. So what happens is that when you live this life many times, again, using the Connors analogy, In fact, funnily enough, the Russian language edition of my first book is called Groundhog Life, which is, I thought was fascinating. The Russians really hit the nail on the head there. So remember, Connors, after he's lived his life many, many times, he then moves on to the next day. And I believe that's what happens. When we have finished the game, we can then move on. And remember, this all happens in the split second before you die. So technically, you still haven't died. You still haven't got there. This is what the Buddhists would call the bardo state. You know, it's the idea you're in the bardo. You're in this interface between life and death. But when you actually die, you then will move on to whatever it is next, which we have no idea what it is. Or, I argue, you can go back into the game and help other people. And that's where the term of bodhisattva comes from. It's somebody who goes back to help others. And in this particular case, I point out there is a very obscure play written by a guy called J.B. Priestley, who I wrote a biography of a few years ago. Priestley was an English playwright and novelist, and he wrote a story called I Have Been Here Before. And the central character of that play is somebody called Gortler. And Gortler is exactly what I've just described. He's a person who's lived his life many times, and he's gone back into the simulation to help somebody else and help a couple not make a terrible mistake. And again, finally, I'd say people will be bringing ideas here. And I will say, so many movies talk about this. It's in the zeitgeist. Think about movies such as Interstellar. Think about the Tesseract sequence in Interstellar. Think about Vanilla Sky. Think about Butterfly Effect. All these movies are telling you my hypothesis. And it's because everybody subliminally knows that this is right. It's in the zeitgeist. It is right, but we are not allowed to really think about it because the simulation has problems if we start doing so.
Well, we could really have about a 4 or 5 hour podcast because I have a ton of questions to ask you, and I feel like we just got started. But before you go, you're going to be at Contact in the Desert this year. What are you going to be talking about there?
Right. I'm doing all the events I'm doing a lecture, I'm doing an intensive, and I'm doing a kind of a 3-hour event as well. And all of them will be related to near-death experiences and UFO encounters. So my lecture will be explaining the neurology and the theory behind near-death experiences, what the scientists believe is happening. Then I'll do a lecture on my interpretation of what is really taking place. And I'll give some more examples of how I believe that it is created by endogenous generated chemicals within the brain and how the hallucinatory substances work. And the final intensive will be hopefully people who will be coming along to my talk who have had out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, alien abductions. And we will have a full 3-hour discussion of putting meat on the bone of all this. But I'm also in a Contact in the Desert. I'm around all the time. I make it my point to be available to people for the whole time I'm not lecturing. I sit down and I talk to people, we have coffee and we discuss ideas, because that's what I'm there to do. I'm not there to hide. I'm there to interface with people. And that's what I really enjoy about it. I've already made a lot of friends, and there's a lot of friends that'll be coming this year again. And I know that there'll be more people coming to my lectures. Every year, more and more people turn up, and more people are turning up just to see me, which I find astonishing, but really, really nice. So please come along. It's a great experience. Thoroughly enjoy it. It's really, really good. And the atmosphere is great, really. And you've got every single famous person in the UFO field there. Everybody is there. You know, you sit down, talk for hours with Whitley Strieber, you know, this kind of thing. You know, we're all there to chat to. It's really great. It's really great.
Was there anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
At the moment, no. Contact in the Desert is the main one. I'm doing a talk on Colin Wilson, the English writer, when I get back in July. And that really is about it at the moment. I've finished my last book. So at the moment, I'm not intending to write any more, but I'm intending to help other writers. And I've got a number of writers I work with and help them get book deals. And I'm helping them take my work forward. Because I feel, you know, at my age, you know, it's, I'm not as hungry as I used to be, let's say.
Well, before we wrap it up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
Yes, I genuinely believe that death is not the end, and that we are beings, spirits, souls, daemons, having a life experience. But I genuinely believe that death is not the end. And remember, I know an awful lot of people there want life after death because of all the people they have loved that they have lost. In my cheating the ferryman hypothesis, I say, not only will you see them again, but you'll see them again as them, as you loved them, in the circumstances you loved them, not just once, not just twice, but thousands of times. And each time you can go off on adventures that you didn't do in this life. You know, you lost your husband or your wife and you always wanted to go to Hawaii. There will be a future opportunity for you to go to Hawaii. And not only this, and this is profoundly important, Cheating the Ferryman also argues that there is a life that is also lived out because of your ancestors' choices as well. So it means that anything that is possible, that can happen, will happen. And this is, again, something to do with quantum mechanics. But I then argue, therefore, you may have lost a child who died when she was 3 years old of incurable leukemia. There will be a part of the instantation that they've already discovered a cure for leukemia. So your child will live. And it's just a matter of time before you will be in that part of the instantation. And she will live a full life and you'll have grandchildren. That is how liberating Cheating the Ferryman is, which you do not get if you go to heaven and live forever. And you definitely don't get if you're reincarnated as somebody completely different in a completely different culture. Cheating the Ferryman says, you will never lose your loved ones. They will be there with you for as long as you want them to be.
Anthony, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
And thank you, Jeff, for being a great interviewer.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.